Welcome to From Embers, a semi-regular podcast about anarchist news and practice across so-called Canada. We're also a member of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. You know, I did check right before publishing this episode, and it's been about 5 months since we put out something. I think many of us who are involved with anarchist projects, over time can relate to this. Sometimes life does get busy, or that activist tendency to chase the most urgent thing takes over, or priorities just get juggled and certain projects do fall by the wayside for a while. When we started this podcast and decided to call it From Embers, the idea behind that was to take a long-term perspective on the anarchist movement or struggles or the beautiful idea or whatever you call it, and recognizing that while the level of anarchist activity does tend to wildly ebb and flow from place to place and time to time, there are certain infrastructures and traditions that we maintain even through those quiet periods in hopes of keeping those embers warm for the next time that the wind picks up. This is what compelled me to reach out to organizers of the New Year's Eve noise demo in Montreal. This practice of regularly going to jails, prisons, immigration detention centers on New Year's Eve or other times of the year, and making a ton of noise to show solidarity with those locked up and forgotten about, daring to call for a world without borders and prisons at a time when states are militarizing their borders and continually escalating their forms of carceral control. I find this important and inspiring. Here's a sample of the vibe from this year's noise demo in Laval.
Folks inside probably can't hear us, but they said if we got here early enough, they might. So let's make some fucking noise.
No one is illegal on stolen land, and there should be no prisons. There should be no prisons and no borders in Canada and Quebec who are illegitimate settler colonial states that should not exist. Every prisoner and every immigration detainee is a hostage of this state, and we need to leverage our collective power and solidarity so that every wall of every prison will crumble sooner rather than later.
So to my knowledge, noise demos have only really been established as a tradition, at least here in North America, over the last couple decades or so. One zine that's a great resource on this is called 7 Years Against Prison, that was published in Southern Ontario in 2016. I'm going to quote from them. They say, one of the initial intentions of the noise demo in Hamilton was to participate in an international practice of anarchist solidarity with prisoners. In 2009, it was a direct response to a call to support an international hunger strike campaign by anarchist prisoners launched by Gabriel Pombo de Silva from a prison in Germany, end quote. So here in Canada, as far as I'm aware, we've seen noise demos in Southern Ontario, Montreal, Quebec City, Vancouver, Kingston, Halifax, Prince George, and probably more places that I haven't heard about. In Hamilton and Montreal in particular, New Year's Eve noise demos seem to reliably happen every year, or almost every year, and I think that's really valuable. I know at times in my life where I've gotten really busy and have been neglecting, some of the things I want to be working on, I still do end up at one of these noise demos every year, and it really does motivate me to want to get active again. So what follows is a conversation with two organizers of this year's New Year's Eve noise demo at the prison complex in Laval, which is just outside of Montreal. We talk about why it was so successful this year, because the turnout was amazing. The context of prisoner solidarity and anti-prison organizing in Montreal and beyond, and the value of prison noise demos as an anarchist tactic and tradition, as well as where we might go from here. So just a note on the audio, our primary audio recorder failed during this interview. So my apologies. This is our backup audio. Always good to have some redundancy. It's not quite as top quality as we normally like to put out, but we felt this conversation was important enough to publish it anyway. We hope you enjoy this conversation. Okay, do you want to start just by introducing yourselves, how you would like to introduce yourselves, and your relationship to the New Year's Eve noise demo in Montreal this year?
So I'm Virginia. I helped organize the New Year's Eve noise demo this year. I've been involved in various capacities with the New Year's Eve noise demo since at least 2014, although the tradition goes back a little bit longer than that in Montreal. And I also help out with the prison radio show in Montreal.
I'm Jay. I'm one of the organizing group this year, and I've been involved for the last couple years with organizing the demo, and I've been going to it, probably almost since the beginning.
That's a great segue, because I want to ask about the beginning. That's the first thing I wanted to ask was, how did this tradition get established? Obviously, it's also an internationally sort of practiced tradition among anarchists and others. From your own perspective here in Montreal, how did that, the noise demo tradition come to be?
My memory of it is that people started doing it in Southern Ontario, and there was enough social back and forth between anarchists in Southern Ontario and anarchists here that the year after they started doing it in Southern Ontario, we tried to do one here. If I remember correctly, that first year, it wasn't a publicly called demonstration, and people took a school bus to Bordeaux, which is the men's provincial prison that is on the island of Montreal, and set off some fireworks outside of the prison at midnight and then called it a night.
What, in your view, is a noise demo, and why are noise demos something worth doing?
I think, a noise demo is definitely generally like a show, in this case for sure, it's a show of solidarity with folks who don't have access to other forms of solidarity and don't necessarily get to participate in demos. In this case, I think it's really important that it's extra loud, it's extra fun for everybody that comes along. It's generally pretty lighthearted, it can get kind of chaotic. Yeah, I think that the folks inside really get there's prison radio, there's support campaigns and everything else, but on times like New Year's when things are particularly destitute feeling inside and isolating, I think it's really important to have a big show of solidarity. In those cases, having noise demos outside of prisons or, outside of a courtroom, something where generally the mood is pretty low, it's nice to kind of break that monotony. I think also for us as demonstrators, it's important to break the monotony also. Mm-hmm. So having something that's a little bit more lighthearted, a little bit more fun, a little bit more safe chaos than some of the other chaos that we often face can be a really important thing.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of the noise demos I've been at have been outside of, as Jay was saying, prisons, migrant detention centers, youth jails, things like that, institutions where often people are there being held against their will and can't leave. And it's just a really important way to show those people that there are people on the outside who care about them, especially in political contexts like the one we've been in for a long time now in Canada, where, there's this very specific view of who ends up in prison, especially. I think there's been a lot of law and order politics in this country for a long time now, where prisoners are seen as people who transgressed against the law of society and therefore are not worthy of this kind of solidarity. And it feels important to push back against that and say, no, people in prison deserve dignity and, in our view, deserve to not be in prison at all because we don't believe in a world with prisons. And so noise demos can be a way to push back against those politics of law and order too, I think. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if you could sort of discuss the role of anarchists in the prison abolition and prisoner solidarity movement generally, and how that sort of relates to the specific tactic or tradition of noise demos.
In my memory of the early years of the New Year's Eve noise demo here, it was coming out of a specifically insurrectionary anarchist tendency. I assume someone from Europe came here and was like, we're doing this in Europe, or the Greeks
I believe there was a Greek call. Yes.
Or the Greeks started doing it and then we started doing it. And that was in a time period when I believe there were a lot of Greek insurrectionary anarchists in prison at the time, or some very, visible ones who were writing things a lot. And so prison struggles were very much on the mind of this certain anarchist tendency. And people were really into trying to figure out how to make that a more visible practice amongst anarchists in Canada. Canada is a very different context. We didn't have political prisoners in the way that people understand that term in the US and in Europe, where a lot more political movement people end up in prison for very long periods of time. There is not as much of that here. And so it's not like there was an anarchist in prison here who was kind of the spark for this to start happening here. But I think people were thinking about being anarchists who could potentially do prison time. I mean, the G20 was not that long after all of these things started, or was right when all these things started. A bunch of anarchists were facing a bunch of charges. I know some of the early noise demos in Southern Ontario were going to prisons where G20 prisoners were being held. So there was a bit of that. That would have maybe been an early catalyst for this, but I don't think it is as much a part of the reasons why we do this in Montreal, at least. I know people are aware that they could end up in prison, and so I think it's like a useful way for people to situate themselves in relation to prison as anarchists, but there hasn't been as much of the there's an anarchist prisoner in this prison and that's why we go happening here.
In my, I don't know how actually connected these things are, but in my sort of narrative of that history in this country, incarceration of the Direct Action 5 and Bulldozer as a project out of Toronto, and there is an anarchist participation in prison abolition that's maybe non-linear over that time that I think people also look to for inspiration.
Yeah, definitely. I know in Kingston there were campaigns happening around prison expansion projects back in the day that, people who had been incarcerated as part of Direct Action Group were peripheral to those projects, and so people had those relationships and knew about that history. I have seen communists writing about how anarchists were the ones who were really good at prisoner solidarity in the aftermath of, everyone getting locked up in the 70s and people who were involved in more armed struggle groups getting decades and decades long sentences. And a project like Bulldozer, like you mentioned, which, if people don't know, was publishing a lot of back and forth writing between different prisoners, became a vehicle for political people who were in prison to write letters back and forth to each other and argue out different theoretical points and keep each other posted about what was happening in the prisons that they were in. And we don't have, a journal exactly like that anymore, but certainly the Anarchist Black Cross Network in the US carries on that tradition. There isn't an ABC in Montreal. That hasn't been a part of the tradition here so much. I think there used to be a long time ago, but not since I've lived here. And yeah, certainly non-linear, but it's there in kind of the anarchist milieu of the US and Canada.
Okay, so back to the Montreal Noise demo, if that's all right. So why do they happen at Laval, and what is it about the geography and or social connections in Laval that leads to these demos happening there?
Well, I think the simplest thing is that there's so many in such a small concentration area. There's also right at the start, there's this old federal prison that's closed, and it's just this huge imposing building. It's quite the backdrop for the start of the whole thing. So aside from aesthetics, of course, which is obviously not the reason of the demo, but it helps, it doesn't hurt. There's Virginia said, there's 4 prisons on the same street. So it's super easy to go there. There's also a migrant prison or migrant detention center there that's new. So there was a lot of resistance to that as it was getting built. It's just so obvious and clear in that spot. Honestly, it's an easy target as well, right? Because they're also close.
I think one of the other reasons we go out there is because the final stop, although in years past it has been the first stop and the final stop, depending on whether we go up and down the block, starting at which end of the block, but there's a prison out there that is a minimum security men's federal prison where the cell blocks, people are in what the prisoners call the condos, and so they have windows facing the street that's not very, and the buildings themselves are not very far from the street. So you have this, building with all these windows that's maybe 100 feet from the street itself with a big fence in the middle, but they can roll down their windows, they can see us, they're dancing in the windows when we come by, they're turning their lights on and off, they're yelling stuff out the windows to us. In early years of this demo, I think people used to be out in the yard, and the yard was also facing the road so we could see people And people at that prison in particular have had such a strong positive reaction to this demo that we have felt obligated to go back there every year, even though, there's 2 prisons on the island of Montreal. Through the Prison Radio show, we have relationships with different people on the inside. We've had people write to us and want us to publicize various things that happen in those federal prisons out there mostly. And we've heard from people after the demo that they love it. They're explaining to their friends why people are out there. I don't think that a lot of people in prison have come into contact with the idea that there are people outside of prison who don't think prison should exist. And so when we are out there with these banners that say, prison abolition, or no one should be in prison, or free all the prisoners, there's a chance for people to explain those things to each other. And through the relationships that we've had, I think people understand why we come out there and then can spread the word about who these people are who show up on New Year's Eve every year.
There's also, at that spot where there's the 4 prisons, there's like the medium security, there's the women's prison, there's the migrant detention, and then the condos. And each one also kind of gives a bit of an opportunity to talk about a different issue, which is kind of nice. The medium, we know that they can kind of hear us a little bit if we start at the right time, when they have a little bit more access, they're not locked down yet. The women's prison, sometimes you can hear people yelling back, which is also like a good boost, for everybody that's there. The migrant detention center, this is also, each of the locations can bring out a different crowd that want to express solidarity with their, what's a good term for that?
Communities that people come from. Solidarity Across Borders brings out a big crowd specifically who want to go to the migrant detention centers.
Yeah, exactly. So then, and then the condos at the end, like Virginia said, is just like really, it's like uplifting for us, like we can actually communicate with them. And so having each spot speak to a different crowd, it brings out more people, it brings out a chance to bring out more issues, and like in that way, the diversification of that spot also makes it an ideal location.
Yeah, and that it sort of ties in with, like, I'm hearing that the sort of specific ways that this demo has happened has like evolved over the years, to some extent in relationship with like learning more about how the prisons operate internally, like their schedules, like you say, you get to one at a particular time, it's before they're fully locked down and they can actually hear better. What kinds of like what has the role been of different connections you have with people who are incarcerated or ex-prisoners who can either participate or share information about how those things work, and how has that played into how the action has evolved over the years?
Certainly we get requests sometimes, like, try and show up to this spot before this time because we get locked in for the count at this time. And I think Solidarity Across Borders, there's been specific years where they've had specific people in the migrant detention center who they know, who they are campaigning around, so that stop becomes kind of like a chance to visibilize a specific person's fight against usually getting deported, because people in the migrant detention center are usually facing deportation and not facing necessarily like a long stretch of time in that prison, although immigration detention in Canada works in a way where people can be held indefinitely, so there's certainly people who are in there for a very long period of time and don't know when they'll get out. The relationships at the minimum have been more about helping the people who know why we're there have the tools to spread the word to the other people who can see us every year about why we're there. And I think there have been years where we've taken song requests from people there and just played music for them for a while. It's been a while since we've had a loud enough sound system for that to make sense, but I do remember in the early years of this, we were able to get a sound car up and down the street, and so we did have like a pretty loud sound system. The cops have stopped us from being able to do that in more recent years.
Yeah, I think the energy that the a little bit of back and forth that's possible brings to the organizing crew really helps perpetuate the demo. Like, we know that what we're doing, the folks inside are able to connect with that and feel the solidarity that's expressed through the noise demo. And I think that that's really important for like the longevity of an action. Like, we know it has an impact. And so that is kind of, I think, one of the most important things, to have that back and forth and feedback with the folks that are inside.
Yeah, there has been a growing crew who organize Prisoner Justice Day every year on August 10th, like who organize a vigil on the outside. And it matters to those people partly because a handful of them have done a lot of time in prison and are now out on parole, and they feel like recognizing PJD on the outside is a way to honor the people who are still practicing it inside, who they would have done a lot of time with in the past. And they have been very supportive of the noise demo. Yeah, there's different people who, you know, want to tell us things they've experienced inside that they want us to include for the MCs to mention. I think this year, one of the things that got through, you know, Prison Radio contacts was that the federal prisons have started charging prisoners for salt. So if you want your meal to be salted, you have to pay extra money in a situation where you're already not making any money. And little things like that get through that we can then share with the crowd, because as Jay said, you know, the demo also functions as a bit of a popular education method for the crowd. If there's people in the crowd who don't know a ton about prison, it's a good way to share that information. But yeah, certainly like the contacts that have come up through Prisoner Justice Day have helped us feel like we're connected to people who know a lot about what's going on in those prisons and know a lot about the conditions and how bad they can be at the holidays, and who reinforce this feeling that like it's important to go and share some cheer with people, because, you know, it's just super rough to do time inside. You know, you're not going to get visits on Christmas. You're not going to get visits on New Year's Eve. There's not enough guards working those days. Everyone's on holiday. You're locked down a lot because when there's too few guards, they deal with that situation by locking people in their cells for 24 hours at a time. And I don't know. I mean, I've known guys who've died during the holidays because they just couldn't handle the situations inside, and it makes it feel even more important to go out there and show people that there's people on the outside who care about them and are thinking about them.
What are some of the sort of events in the last year in the Quebec jails and prisons that influenced some of the things that you were talking about or thinking about at this year's noise demo?
We had a few things we mentioned in the call out. One of them was a wildfire that happened in the northern part of Quebec, where there's a maximum security men's prison called Port Cartier. It was a men's federal prison that got evacuated during the wildfires this past summer, which meant that, you know, a couple hundred people got shipped into other federal prisons in the province, causing a situation of pretty severe overcrowding for like the rest of the summer, which is pretty intense for people. I also think thinking about, you know, a lot of people on the outside are thinking about climate change. A lot of people on the inside are thinking about climate change. Thinking about how that's going to impact prisoners is something that doesn't get talked about enough. So we brought it up in our call out this year as something to raise awareness about. And there was also a riot in a youth jail in Quebec City a couple months ago that, you know, led to some teens getting extra charges and ending up with extra time that they had to do. But we brought it up as like a moment of resistance that we wanted to point out to people, because it can be really hard to keep track of moments of resistance in prison because they're not very well publicized. So we were telling people about that. And then there was a third thing that happened a month ago in a jail in Sorel Tracy, like a provincial jail, where a prisoner beat the heck out of a guard, and the guard ended up in the hospital. And in retaliation for that, I mean, obviously this individual prisoner is going to face extra charges and have to do extra time if they get convicted, et cetera, but the guards union decided to do like a 1-day lockdown of every single provincial prison in Quebec, which is a pretty intense reaction. Par for the course for the guards to do some sort of like collective punishment for a situation like that. But yeah, they locked down everyone in provincial prison in the province for a day. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's like further retaliation, because the guards union now wants all these things as a result of that situation. And when the guards union wants stuff, they take it out on the prisoners in order to get what they want. Often just denying people yard time and keeping people locked up a lot. And then the last thing was that 3 people escaped from the migrant detention center a couple weeks ago. The news was saying they maybe climbed the fence. I'm not totally sure what happened, but we were pretty excited about that, so we included that in the call out too.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how this year's noise demo went. And I was there and personally noticed a really good turnout. It seemed like several hundred people showed up. Is that normal? And, you know, can you talk about maybe why you think so many people are showing up to this thing and how things kind of went this year?
Yeah, it was a huge turnout this year. I think the biggest that I've personally ever seen. I don't know how it happened. There's obviously a lot of stuff going on right now. Like there's a lot of Palestinian solidarity organizing happening. There's a lot of people that are politically charged at the moment. Not necessarily just anarchists, obviously, or prison abolitionists, but people that see a little bit more intersectionality in their politics. And I think that also helped. It was a beautiful day. Like, it was really warm and dry, which doesn't happen. Usually if it's warm, it's raining, or it's super cold. So like the weather, the other stuff going on in the city, I think also probably the 3 people that escaped, I would guess, got some people fired up that maybe would be a little bit like, oh, I'm going to go, maybe I won't go.
In early December, 3 migrant detainees successfully escaped from this immigration center. We salute their courage, may their resistance inspire us, and may 2025 be the year where all borders and prisons will fall. Thank
you. The energy was great right from the start, I think, as well. Like, people were showing up at the buses and they were just like, half the crowd was already blocked up. and chaos of fireworks right away. Everybody was cheering, so many chants. It was like such great energy. Lots of people brought noisemakers.
There were people doing graffiti. I haven't seen people do graffiti at that demo in a long time.
Yeah.
Someone got arrested doing graffiti at that demo in the very early years of that demo when we were only like 30 to 50 people out there max. But when we're more than a couple hundred people, it's totally chill, it seemed like, for people to be doing graffiti. Someone tagged ACAB on one of the like signs pointing you towards the prison institutions. I think someone wrote "Fire to the Prisons" on another prison. Like, it was a pretty amped up crowd, which was fun. And I do think that the context of Palestine Solidarity demos have made demo culture look a little bit different. Like, I think people have gotten really used to being in the streets in the last year, and it's having impacts in places that I didn't totally expect, like this demo.
And the police response?
Par for the course, I'd say. They seem to do a thing now where they will have the Laval riot police lined up out front of the migrant detention center before we even get there. They also seemed very keen on not wanting to let us into one specific parking lot that we weren't even trying to get to, that's right next to the minimum. But they didn't do the thing that they did last year where they marched along with the march for... there's a bit of a long walk between the immigration detention center and the minimum, and often the cops will try and march along the sides of the street with us, but they didn't even try to do that this year.
Yeah, they just were they were stationed at their spots and they didn't try and follow us. Last year, there was a couple points where we kind of led the cops through a ditch and a whole bunch of them fell down, which was great. And along the long walk, there's often conflict at that spot, so the cops will be trying to flank us, but it's a bit of a slope there, and so the banners will be lined up along the side, and there's usually some scuffles, and nothing serious that I remember happening with that type of thing there. But yeah, this year they just kind of set up at a few spots. They had the drone out, I guess whatever, Laval can have toys too, so they had their drone out, but I think they didn't realize that the drone everyone's going to shoot fireworks at it, and there was a few lasers and stuff, so the drone came down pretty early, I think, which was pretty cool.
How did they not realize that?
I know, right? Almost like they can't think of things outside of their small context, right?
Well, I mean, the Laval cops only get one practice round every year, and it's this demo.
So, for people who aren't familiar, Laval is not within the city of Montreal, so they have a separate police force from the much better equipped, better trained SPVM of Montreal.
They guard the door of the migrant detention center. Like, it's a glass door. Maybe it's actually like a weak point, but there's always just. This year, and I think last year they also did that. They just lined up right in front of those doors.
Is that because there was a campaign against the construction of that detention center, that they're so worried about that spot, do you think?
Possibly. I mean, Solidarity Across Borders also does demos out there, not irregularly.
Right.
And I think there was a year where people were banging on a fence at the immigration detention center used to be in a different spot out there. It was in an old prison, also on the same block, but a different spot. And then they built a brand new building that there was a big campaign around. And so at the old spot, there was a year where people were banging on the fence that they had up to try and keep us maybe a little ways away from the prison, and the fence fell down. and that was maybe something that stressed them out. Then they built this new prison, and in the context of building this new prison, there was a huge campaign against it that I think mostly failed because the pandemic hit, and it was like building momentum, but once the pandemic hit, I think it became kind of hard to figure out what to do next. But that campaign was pretty fierce. There was like a decent amount of property destruction that happened in the context of that campaign. I think I would assume that all of the authorities out in Laval were stressed about it, because I'm not even sure if that drone would have been Laval cops necessarily, because Correctional Services Canada, which runs the federal prisons, also has their own security force, and they have shown up and freaked out at the demo in years past. I know there was one year where someone who was like a guard pulled a gun at the demo, and that was before the Laval cops would even show up or know what to do. So it's entirely possible the drone belonged to CSC.
I guess I'm wondering about that because I'm interested in how, like, things like noise demos, which can be very scary to initiate in a place where it's never happened before, because it is not something that, you know, federal or provincial guards are like used to dealing with, and you don't know how they're going to react. Like, how has the police response changed since like the first couple years, and like is it basically like there's been like some kind of like balance of power like established there, and expectations and normalization happening in a good way, in the sense of like creating a tradition that's possible to do every year?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, in one of the very early years of the demo, there weren't any Laval cops around, and CSC guards were trying to figure out how to deal with it, and one of them, I think, got kind of stressed out, and I don't remember if he pulled his gun out and pointed it at people, or if he just, like, showed us he had one and put his hand on it, or what, but I remember that being kind of stressful. And then in the early years when the Laval cops would come, before they had a Laval cop riot squad, which it used to just be, like, regular Laval cops showing up, they also were never really sure what to do, and sometimes there would be like shoving matches and things like that. And yeah, now it's kind of normalized into they're not worried that we're trying to rush the fences of the prisons anymore, and they don't even try and stop people from setting off fireworks. I think in years past they would also get really stressed about the fireworks, and they, in the last however many years, have not. But the thing about prisons in most places, and this is, you know, Barton Jail in the middle of Hamilton is an exception to this, but most prisons are built in places that are kind of out of the way. And so when you're doing a noise demo, you're not in an area where there's a lot of foot traffic. You're not necessarily going to have some other reason why you're there once the demo disperses. I think that's why we started bringing school buses out to Laval, because we didn't want people to have to find their own way home, because it's pretty difficult to do. I know in Southern Ontario, the way this tradition is played out is actually somewhat different, and they don't go to the same place all the time, and they've done car caravans to get people to the different locations. So that has been an option for them in terms of keeping the cops on their toes by always going to a different jail, except for Barton, which I think is really easy because it's just right in downtown Hamilton. Or not downtown Hamilton, but it's right in the city of Hamilton. But yeah, I think people thinking about doing this in their own towns, the first couple years are going to be a bit rough until people in your town figure out what it is you're trying to do, and you find the right people who would want to come to something like this. And, you know, once you get the crowd size big enough, it kind of has a momentum of its own. And we've certainly like passed that mark at some point, and has become a bit of the cops know what we're there for, we know what we're there for, and we kind of just do our own thing.
So knowing the logistics of where you can set up, that won't stress out the police. Because also the idea is not that we have a conflict with the police, right? At this demo. The idea is that we're getting a message to the people inside that they're not forgotten. And as much as we might want to fight the police, it's, you know, not the goal of this demo. So, and knowing the police response in your town, knowing where to go, if you can get some information from the inside about like what they can hear and what they can't hear, I think that's obviously really great. Like we talked about, if you have a spot where there's even like some grass beside the fence of the thing where you can be out of the traffic, you know, anything like that, just kind of, it's going to keep the police a little bit more de-escalated, right? And that's pretty key, I think. And for us, because it's become such a tradition, I think that the police know that what we're there for.
Yeah, that makes me think of when we go to Bordeaux and how we decided where to go at Bordeaux. And some of it was about walking the whole, like, eventually having done different spots around the perimeter of the prison and realizing that the spot that worked the best was a spot where the fence surrounding the site of the prison is right next to a public road. There's a sidewalk there that's technically public property or whatever. So we're not like walking into the parking lot of the prison that's like could be fenced off with a fence. Like I think not walking into an area where it would be really easy for them to like close a gate behind us and get us all stuck in a spot, but finding spots that are easy to leave from, pretty accessible to get to, where people can still hear us, and testing those out over the years. Certainly at Bordeaux, we can't see anybody, but we've been able to hear people really well at certain spots, and keeping in mind what those spots are and trying to go back to them. But yeah, I mean, knowing when the count is, knowing when visiting hours are, those kinds of things can really help in terms of not showing up at a time when, you know, you might be interrupting something that people also really want. Like we've really tried to like not have these noise demos happen during visiting hours so that we don't disrupt people's ability to see their families. I don't think we've always been successful at that, and I think that's okay, but...
Just one other thought I have about, like, because I'm obviously taking a anarchist tradition perspective here, but I think there is also, with any tradition that you establish, like, there's the question of how to keep it from getting stale and how to continue building on it, or it's not always appropriate to escalate, but how do you build on that and move forward further towards your goals? So do you have any ideas about where things can go from here? If this is sort of like a high point, this is one of the best years that's happened, like, how does it get better from here?
When I got asked this question years ago, I said something about wanting to expand maybe like demographics of the demo is one way to say it, like try and reach out to different crowds. I do think sometimes in Montreal we can have this problem where the demos are the same faces, and not necessarily like there's always a new young generation who's like come up and is starting to do stuff who will show up at stuff too, but we tend to draw from a very like university-centric crowd, and that can be true at the New Year's Eve Noise demo too. And I think we've thought in years past about how to get more people to come who are maybe more personally connected to people who've been spending time inside or who have done time inside themselves. It's really tricky because those people are obviously risking a lot more showing up. Like it can be really hard to figure out how to show up at something like this if you know you might get in trouble or think you might get banned from seeing a loved one inside or something like that. Like that can be a heavy thing to do. But yeah, I do think continuing to think through like who isn't showing up at the demo and do we want them to, and how would we go about trying to have different people show up at the demo is a useful exercise. We did lose a bit of momentum at a certain point because of the pandemic. I think in 2020 and 2021 and 2022, the demo was word of mouth, got really small for a few years again, and it's only in the last 2 years that we've started doing the like public thing with buses, which allows you to think more about having goals for it. I think for a few years there, it was just like the goal is to keep it happening, even though there's like very low energy and it's tricky to figure out how to even have a demo for a minute. But yeah, I don't know. What would you say for that one?
Based on the last few years, it has diversified a lot. So I think that your dreams and goals for it have been at least a little bit realized. It was nice to have like 2 buses. Like the buses really is like a nice kind of cool networking thing. A lot of new folks to the demo are like chatting with you know, people that have been coming for years. I think that's really cool because it gets folks engaged. Like in the last few years, well, last year we had buses as well, but for the few years before that, when there weren't buses, there wasn't that kind of like networking thing. Like there'd be a meetup, people would all get in their cars, you know, you take some strangers in your car, whatever, or something like that, and then you're chatting. But I think that having the buses is like a networking thing to keep people or to bring in new people and everything, because a demo like this, it's so inspiring. So it's great for that, but it's really hard without that element to kind of keep people engaged. So when you're coming back, like I'm sure like people were chatting with whoever's sitting beside them on the bus, and like the person beside me was like, oh, what else is going on? Like, how can I be more engaged? So it's like that kind of stuff is like really cool. Personally, one thing I think would be cool is to have some kind of event after where there's just more of that networking and some folks get kind of a little bit more brought in. Like new people can feel like they're a part of something because there's a New Year's Eve party after.
Yeah, the only other thing I'd add is we're continuously trying to figure out how to get a loud enough sound system. Since the years that we haven't been able to reliably bring a sound truck down the street, it's been hard to figure out how to get a sound system that's loud enough for the size of crowd.
Yeah, so if people are interested in learning more about this or getting connected in with anarchist or abolitionist movements in Montreal or elsewhere, do you have like resources or advice to someone listening who's like, this sounds great, but it's, mid-January and I don't want to wait 11 months to participate?
I know that the Prisoner Justice Day Montreal Instagram account was posting like a bit of a teaser. They weren't the group that organized the demo, but we obviously have relationships with them, and they always do something on August 10th. It's usually a vigil in Little Burgundy. But there's a bunch of other stuff happening in the next year that would be useful for people to keep an eye on. There's the Aura, which is the revolutionary anarchist organization in town, are organizing an anarchist training camp at the end of March. If you look up Rafales, I think they are starting to have social media accounts specifically about that. I know that they're going to have a panel at that event about prison abolition. So people who are new to that kind of stuff and want to learn more, that would be a really good place to tune in and try and find more people. I think there will be social events affiliated with that. There's also always the book fair. Constellation is doing the Anarchist Book Fair again this year, and that'll be partway through May, usually towards the end of May. There's always panels and workshops there about prison stuff. But in terms of groups that are easy to join, there's not a ton these days. I know I brought up the PJD Montreal account because they posted a little teaser being keep paying attention to this space to find out about new projects that might be fun for people to join. I know there's a bit of talk. There used to be a group called the Anti-Carceral Group that would do letter writing events and public events and pop ed kind of stuff, and that was a very open, easy way for people to join and get involved in stuff, but it hasn't been super active in a few years. There's also a podcast that is hosted on the Prison Radio Show's archives called What Happened to Prisoner Justice Day. So if all of this talk about Prisoner Justice Day is new to you, you can go check out that podcast. It's a pretty good introduction to what PJD is and some of the struggles in the federal prisons in Canada in the 1970s that led to PJD. There's also tons of zines available online. Montreal Counterinfo has a lot of information about prisons from an anarchist perspective. North Shore Counterinfo in Ontario has a lot of stuff, and they've done lots of noise demos over the years. So if you look at the publications page for their website, I think there's a zine out about the history of noise
7
demos.
Years Against Prison.
Yeah, so people could check that out if they wanted to. And then, as Jay said, there's always lots of things going on in Montreal, and some of them are very open, want people to take their own initiative and organize their own events, and Constellation would definitely be a great time for someone to make another noise demo happen.
Now on the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network, tune into The Beautiful Idea,
a project from a collective of several anarchist and autonomous media producers scattered around the world.
We're bringing you interviews and stories from the front lines of autonomous social movements and struggles,
as well as original commentary and analysis.
Episodes include action news, interviews with frontline organizers, and deep dive discussions.
Check out thebeautifulidea.show and the Channel Zero Network for more information.